Hi there, Matt.
Hey, Bill, how are you?
I'm good. You're doing your second The Weekend blog in 1 week.
Yes, it's like the 3-day in blog. But
You're breaking
welcome
records.
back. That's right, welcome back, by the way. We missed you while you were gone.
Thank you very much. Won't be as much fun as Rachel Sklar on the streets of Manhattan, but I'll do my best.
Yeah, she was actually at O'Hare, and she filled in
O'Hare, I'm sorry.
valiantly for you. But she's a roving reporter, and so you never know. Maybe next time, who knows where she'll be. So, but it was good to have her. But we're glad to have you back.
Well, perhaps we should start with what maybe isn't quite the big story in the conservative blogosphere this week, but looks to be next week, which is we've already had some conservative Tea Party rallies, but this is intended to be the biggest coordinated series of Tea Party rallies, I guess, on tax day.
Yeah, on April 15th, there are going to be, it looks to be perhaps even thousands of these Tea Parties in little, communities and big cities and everything in between all across America. And, RedState today had a post up about it. Interestingly, Michelle Malkin had an interesting piece about Acorn potentially infiltrating these things. Now, it's funny.
What does that mean? How do you infiltrate?
I think that what will happen is, well, a couple things. One, clearly there will be liberals who show up for whatever reason, whether it's to just...
Well, it's a good show.
Yeah. I also think, though, the other thing that... And by the way, if you read Michelle Malkin's piece, this rumor of Acorn, there's a link to it, which leads to a link about it, which leads to a link by some lady named Kiki. So it's not really backed up by anything other than somebody saying that I guess they heard that Acorn is going to infiltrate them. Now, the truth is, I have absolutely no doubt Acorn will do this, or some people who are part of Acorn or whatever will be there. But I think the other part of Malkin's point, which I think is perhaps more relevant, is that there will be an attempt by the left, liberal bloggers, whatever, to sort of diminish or mock these Tea Parties. And I think that's probably the more...
Well, I think that's already started.
Yeah, it has.
As I would say, any liberal protest during the Bush era, I think, was roundly mocked on the right from the get-go.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Obviously, this is an example of people getting together. What's really exciting, though, I tell you from a conservative perspective, is the grassroots nature of this. And in some ways, it's difficult to keep track of who's going to be attending because there's some bloggers helping organize it. There's a few national organizations who are helping put it together, but it truly is an organic thing that isn't being a top-down thing. So we'll have to see what happens, but it's going to be very interesting.
Is there a message to these rallies? I mean, is it just that we hate everything that's going on, or is there a focus to this? Is there a specific thing that they are trying to accomplish?
That's a good question. I think that in some ways the message is unclear. I do think that the one thing, obviously, is the stimulus. I guess the Rick Santelli CNBC rant was one of the not necessarily the thing that fueled this, but one of the things that sort of ignited this grassroots passion and this movement. And so it does seem like probably the most important thing is the sort of spending and rejection of the spending. But I think some people who are going because they care about gun riots or whatever. So it will be interesting to hear what's said. If I were Move On or if I were Acorn, I would go and tape everything that's said, from the lectern, because let's face facts. I mean, there's going to be a lot of local celebrities, local radio hosts from my hometown of Frederick, Maryland, or Fargo, North Dakota, whom you never know what they might say. And I guarantee you that somebody in some town will say something radical, and that will be on the Daily Kos or whatever. Maybe even
as
MSNBC.
if you're going to have liberals there with handheld cameras trying to catch something.
Right.
What I find fascinating about that is I'm doing cheap book plugs for myself when I can on Blogging Heads. I had a chapter in my book about what makes a successful protest.
Yeah.
And I actually stopped and thought, okay, what are good examples of successful protests? And I couldn't really think of any, except for the March on Washington and Martin Luther King. Most protests, don't achieve their goal. They don't actually get the thing done they want to get done. And probably,
do you mean in terms of actually in other words, so like the march, the Right to Life march, they may accomplish.
Abortion's still here.
Okay, so that's what you're saying, because they may accomplish.
There are lots of marches on the Iraq War. The Iraq War is still here.
Okay, I see what you mean.
But March on Washington actually got the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. The March in '63, bill passed in '64. It actually, had a direct impact. And I think the easiest liberal protests to mock are exactly the ones that don't have a clear focus, aren't timely, don't have an achievable goal to reach, a hodgepodge of every issue. You have the one guy, legalized pot in the back, that's always there. Someone wants to, attack capitalism. Someone wants to attack the war, or what have you. And you just have this mishmash of the fringe. And and the left often has struggled with that being the face of liberalism, the cacophony of protests as opposed to a clearly articulated philosophy and a set of issues.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I would say this. I think that one of the very interesting good things that could come out of this from a conservative perspective is that I believe that there are a lot of activists who will show up at these Tea Party rallies sort of organically. Because for the first time ever, for whatever reason, the spark has been ignited and they're passionate about it. And I think there's a chance to, and I know there's some efforts by some conservative groups to do text messaging to collect their information so that maybe we have people who've never been involved, never volunteered on campaigns before, whatever, never donated to causes, who will be brought into the conservative movement now because of these tea parties. But I do see your point, and I think it's a legitimate one to be debated. I mean, how, if the energy and effort that was going into organizing a tea party went into, say, going door to door on behalf of, the Republican candidate in New York 20, he would have won, right? And so you can always make an argument that there are more effective ways other than protesting.
You still there?
I am here.
Oh, I thought I lost you for a second. At the risk of giving advice to the other side, it almost seems like the grassroots right is at an infancy point. How do we start a populist grassroots movement? That's not typically how conservatism has come into power in the past, and you're sort of trying new things. And I know that there are folks on the right that mock Saul Alinsky and Rules for Radicals, the book that came out several decades ago, and try to tie it to Obama. But Rules for Radicals is really a fantastic book.
I've read
it.
I have, and I've read it years ago, actually.
It'd probably be if folks haven't already on the right, probably would behoove them to memorize that and use that as
the only book I know of actually. The only book I know of actually that was dedicated to Satan.
Perhaps maybe 5 steps ahead of me.
Well, maybe something by Aleister Crowley or Ozzy Osbourne, but it's the only political book I know that's dedicated to the Prince of Darkness and not Ozzy or Bob Novak. So anyway, regardless of how effective this is or whatever, it is a phenomenon. It does appear to be completely organic, spontaneous. There are some people trying to organize it, but it's sort of letting a thousand flowers bloom. And you'll be hearing a lot about it this week, to be sure.
Do you know which Tea Party rally that Joe the Plumber will be at?
I'm sure he will be at one of them. I have no doubt that he will be attending one.
What's the big one in D.C.?
I don't know. There is one in D.C. I actually saw on RedState today. They had a link up. And it was funny because they quoted like Gandhi, which was like first they ignore us, then they mock us, then they whatever. I mean, I don't mean to like just make lightly treat Gandhi's quote, but each line, but I don't know it by heart. But each line had a link to a different sort of blog. It was kind of cool the way they did it. It was almost like a haiku or something. And each link went to a different conservative post about the Tea Parties. And the guy who put it up said he was going to be at the DC Tea Party, and he linked to it. I'm guessing it's at the mall. I don't know if I'm going to go. I don't typically go to things like that, but who knows? Maybe
you just report on it.
Yeah, maybe I will. It seems like everybody. It's almost like everybody's going to be there with their flip camera and twittering. There's I think Pound Tea Party or something is probably going to be the tag. So it'll be interesting and talked about, and I'm sure both sides will find something interesting in it.
So speaking of RedState, there was another RedState post that you flagged that you thought was notable.
I do, and a lot of times we do the weekend blog, and a lot of the stuff we talk about is really just stuff that everybody's talking about, like in the news or whatever, and we're just saying what bloggers said about it. But this is actually a blog story that I found interesting. My friend Eric Erickson at RedState, who basically runs RedState, wrote a couple posts, and also actually the directors did an editorial basically encouraging Virginia Republicans to oust the chairman, Jeff Frederick, whom I've also met, and he was the chairman, fairly young guy in his 30s, conservative. He was the chairman of the Virginia Republican Party, and this week he was actually ousted by the State Central Committee, and it took 3/4 of the vote, which is really, really hard to pull off if you can believe it. And I think it was interesting because essentially you had a national conservative blog, RedState, taking a position on a state chairman's race. And then Eric Erickson put up a post a little bit later, because here's what's going to happen. The former chairman, Jeff Frederick, the Central Committee ousted him, but he now, instead of just sort of going down gracefully, and by the way, the gubernatorial candidate in Virginia and all 6 Republican congressmen from Virginia have called for Jeff Frederick to be ousted as chairman. This is unbelievable. But it turns out, so Jeff Frederick, though, he was ousted by the Central Committee, but there's a big state convention. The Virginia Republican Convention is, I think, in May. I'm actually going to be a delegate to it. So I'll be there. And Jeff Frederick's
have you stated your position, who you support?
I'm going to abstain from doing that. But it'll be interesting because he's now running, even though the Central Committee ousted him, he's running, and he's essentially making the argument, Frederick's making the argument that I'm a conservative and the liberal Republican insiders took me down. But in fact, it appears to be just that his personality has managed to anger so many people personally. And Eric Erickson from RedState wrote a post about how when he was at, when Jeff Frederick was at Emory University, Eric Erickson was involved with the college Republicans, and there was a similar thing that happened at the college Republican level, and Jeff Frederick was basically ousted from, or lost the race to become CR chairman. And by the way, the toughest, most nasty races in the world are college Republican races. They're way dirtier than anything you'll ever encounter anywhere else.
Well, the Karl Rove race for the presidency was a fascinating story.
Yeah, and I think wasn't Karl Rove Lee Atwater's campaign manager?
Right, right.
So, but in any event, this was one of those things, and essentially Frederick did the same thing, ripped the college Republicans apart, and that Eric Erickson wrote a post essentially comparing the two, and it appears that Frederick may be now ripping the Virginia Republican Party in half, which is really devastating because Virginia is one of the few states that has big elections. In 2009, Virginia will elect a governor, lieutenant governor. I think the entire state house is up, state senate, and attorney general's race. And here we are, just a few months out from election day, and we have this big turnover in the Virginia Republican Party. Also interesting to note that the reason that Jeff Frederick even became chairman is Ed Gillespie was elected in 2006, served 6 months, left to go work at the White House. Hager, who is President Bush's daughter's father-in-law was the chairman, and Jeff Frederick ousted him. So it's a crazy state. And
well, and I imagine for Eric Erickson, Eric Erickson's conservative bona fides are pretty firm.
Yeah.
So for him to come out and say, this isn't an ideological dispute between Frederick and the other guy. Frederick's just a douchebag is basically what Eric Erickson is saying.
I think that's precisely what he said. And now I think it seems like RedState's supporting a blogger. Well, he's more than just a blogger. A guy named Sean Kenny used to work at the Virginia Republican Party. Young guy. I think he works at the American Life League now, which is a very, very... They make the Right to Life look like liberals. They're a hardcore pro-life group. And he's also been a fairly prominent Virginia blogger. Also of note, rumors are that G. Gordon Liddy's daughter, whose last name is Bourne, Bourne, she's a conservative activist in Virginia. Her name is also being floated. So it's going to be like only about a month and a half away for this convention in Virginia. And it seems like RedState is actually probably going to get behind Sean Kenny for chairman, which will be interesting.
So this is a multi-person race.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be at the convention. I suspect there will be several people because if you think of it, Jeff Frederick was just ousted like Friday night, like a week ago. And then the interim chairman is now running it just sort of temporarily. But I think it's in May, just in like a month and a half from now, the Virginia State Convention will elect a new chairman. So I could get in the race. I could potentially get in the race. I mean, it'll be like the California, gubernatorial thing a few years ago, where you had like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Gary Coleman and porn stars running. So.
Now you'd mentioned another post to me, Ala Pundit at Hot Air, saying that putting some caution against Pat Toomey challenging Arlen Specter in the Republican primary in Pennsylvania, because if Toomey won, that could well mean Democrats pick up the seat and they get the 60 votes in the Senate. And yeah. That struck me. I haven't seen too much that kind of realist pragmatism in the conservative blogosphere too much.
We're going to stamp it out every chance we can get, Bill.
What's that?
And we're going to stamp that out every chance we get.
Well, that's why, I mean, is this happening in Virginia as well? I mean, Virginia's not Pennsylvania, although it's definitely a state that has gone blue recently. Are there folks in the blogosphere, maybe this Eric Erickson post is part of it, saying, the guys who are really super-duper crazy, is there a recalibration in the blogosphere if you're recognizing the position that the Republican Party is in?
That's an interesting question, and what Ala Pundit had to say about Specter, I think that's why I picked it. He said, I think the title was "Conservative Bloggers Might Need to Get into Specter Mania," or something or other like that. I don't think that's the case in Virginia, although it is interesting to note that Jeff Frederick, as Virginia chairman, did have a gaffe, I think, comparing Obama to a terrorist. So I don't want to misquote that. It's a very serious thing.
I believe during the campaign he was encouraging the door knockers to actively compare him to Osama.
There was something like that. I would encourage everyone to Google that to get it exactly what it was. But yeah, it was something. It was a gaffe. It did not look good, and the McCain people certainly were not happy with it. But the truth about the Jeff Frederick thing is it has nothing to do with ideology. He is trying to make it about ideology. He's trying to say, yes, the liberals are coming after me, or the party insiders are coming after me. But think of how difficult it is to get 3/4 of a state central committee to vote against you. That is not, you would really have to try to make that happen. To get 3/4 to vote against you. There was a lot more at play, and from what I understand, is more personality driven than it, and other maybe sort of
if I can shift gears to a story in liberal blogosphere.
Yes.
Specifically the environmental blogosphere. For a couple weeks now, you had a lot of blogs attacking George Will for misrepresenting scientific data about Arctic ice melt. George Will was actively saying that the melt wasn't occurring, and citing the institution said George Will is misrepresenting us, and Will would not back down. And you had a lot of bloggers attacking Will. You had bloggers attacking the Washington Post editorial page editor, Fred Hyatt, saying, this is, it's one thing for a columnist to have opinion based on false information, but you bear the responsibility for printing a column in your pages that's not backed up. What happened after a lot of blog criticism of it, you actually had in the Washington Post this week a news story that explicitly rebutted George Will, and Grist's David Roberts blogged about it. He said, "What jumped out at me is this bit towards the bottom of the piece." This is quoting this Washington Post story. "The new evidence, including satellite data showing that the average multi-year wintertime sea ice cover in the Arctic in 05 and 06 was 9 feet thick, a significant decline from the 1980s, contradicts data cited in widely circulated reports by Washington Post columnist George F. Will that sea ice in the Arctic has not significantly declined since 1979. David Roberts goes on, "I can't think of another instance when a news story at a newspaper explicitly called out an op-ed writer in the same paper for lying by name. It's pretty extraordinary." Then after that, the Washington Post science editor actually called David Roberts because Roberts was speculating this sort of went up the chain to the very top of the Post. But the science editor just said, and this is Roberts' retelling of it, it was actually him who had the idea to reference Will. Since the data, quote-unquote, Will distributed had gotten so much publicity, it was on people's minds. He said he and the reporters agreed it was a routine news judgment, nothing about it struck him as unusual, and as far as he knows, no one above him questioned or was even aware of it. I don't know how much of that is feigned innocence, but it seems there was no big process inside the Washington Post behind this. Nevertheless, still a pretty notable thing for a paper to do, and a number of other bloggers, Joe Rahm at Climate Progress, keeping the pressure on Fred Hyatt. Now that this has been smoked out, you still need to make amends for this. I believe the folks at Wonk Room have written a letter to Fred Hyatt to that end. So this is still churning out there, but it's an example of something that probably would have been ignored was kept alive by a lot of blog chatter to the point where the paper itself felt compelled to respond directly.
Let me ask you, has George Will been generally given a pass, or is it common for, and I know that this environmental thing, George Will's been writing this is sort of a series of columns on this, but just in general thinking back, has he been perceived as being a conservative that liberals have gone after, or is this sort of an unusual thing?
I think there is. Well, there's a couple things there. There's definitely a premium being put. I think in the blogosphere generally, and the environmental blogosphere specifically, when it comes to global warming, to let no global warming misstatement go unchecked. So that they will find an opportunity to push back whenever they can. And, of course, this stuff happens a lot. So a lot of this just becomes background noise, which is very frustrating to environmental bloggers. George Will is probably arguably the most prominent person right now who continually says things like, in the 1970s, everyone thought we were going to have global cooling. So how do you know that this global warming business is just another fad?
That is true.
That type of stuff.
But that is in fact true.
Wow.
And
you and I need to go back and forth on it.
So you're disputing? You dispute that it was generally accepted in the 70s that
it was not generally accepted. There were a couple of folks that speculated about it, but it was nowhere near the level of scientific consensus we have now in terms of climate change.
Okay, fair enough.
So I definitely think there was a desire to not just let Will being particularly obstinate about it, keeping repeating it, was definitely.
I do think it is a pretty damning point to make, and he is specifically quoting from like Newsweek or some generally thought of as reputable mainstream publications who were strongly making the point in the 70s that there was global cooling going on.
that part. I mean, that's different than the specific thing, which was quoting a new study from a current institution. The current institution was saying you are misrepresenting our study. The stuff with the global cooling is plucking out a Newsweek story and a New York Times story from the 70s. I mean, Newsweek's business is stupid trend stories. That's all they do. It's all Time Magazine does.
Right.
And I mean, everyone on the right is upset at Newsweek this week because of death of Christian America. That's what Newsweek does. They make hysterical cover stories like that have very little basis in fact.
But let me go back to the other, what I was asking earlier is, I'm just out of curiosity. I mean, George Will strikes me as the kind of person that liberals might at least respect, as opposed to like an Ann Coulter, for example, who just absolutely drives them crazy. George Will does not really take, quite often he takes sort of maybe moderate to center-right positions. He certainly expresses himself in a somewhat erudite way. Is it? I've not noticed him coming under attack much in the past.
Well, I think that's all the more reason why environmental bloggers took this so seriously, because he has more of a mainstream reputation of someone who is not a liar, someone who you might disagree with ideologically, but is at least giving you an honest and straight, objective assessment of a political situation, willing to be critical of Republicans when need be. Never was a big fan of either Bush. So for him to use his perch to not, I mean, it's one thing to make a mistake about something, but then be called on it and to continue to say it, it exposes more of a blind ideology, and having a perch of the Washington Post, and not to mention ABC, because he says the same stuff in ABC a lot, to have that go unchecked. I mean, so in some ways it's less about Will the person as it is the institutional laxness of letting a guy go unchecked. That's why there's an attempt to step it up and put it on Fred Hyatt's shoulders. So I would think you would see. I don't want to say you'd see more of this, because I think for the most part Republicans are starting to shift away from this straight-up global warming denial approach and doing something more nuanced, sort of like a Jim Manzi. Oh, this is happening, but it's not so bad. There's other ways to approach it. No need to get all hysterical. I think Will, and I don't want to misrepresent him.
I think Will would probably argue that there is climate change, and that it very well may be that it's gotten warmer in the past 10 years or 20 years.
But it's just not that big of a deal. No need to go crazy about it.
Because there's sort of climate change. We had like the little ice age.
Things go up, things go down.
That killed
you can't predict 5 years out what's going to happen.
Right.
That could well be his root position.
By the way, I am drinking vitamin water, and I have a endorsement deal with them. I only drink vitamin water 10, and so all the young aspiring conservative bloggers, it's really good stuff.
Do I get a piece of that ad, everybody?
Are you wearing Nikes? You gotta. All right. Well, I guess my last thing is a quick thing.
Yeah.
And I just found interesting because here we are. We just elected Barack Obama. He was just sworn in, a few months ago, and we have a story from Race for 2012, which I talk about a lot here. John Ensign is in Iowa, and
who is John Ensign?
John Ensign is a senator from Nevada, and he was in Iowa speaking. And here we have Race for 2012 talking about it and speculating. And the thing that I just find interesting, I don't think John Ensign is going to run, although every senator thinks they could be president. But what I find fascinating about it is that the speculation has already started. And I wrote a piece the other day about Huntsman, whom you brought up a couple weeks ago.
And you shrugged me off.
Well, I did, but you got me thinking. That's one of the great things, by the way, about doing this, is it inspires ideas to actually that I go write about later. Like I did one, I don't know if it was with you or with Rachel. I think it was with Rachel where I talked about the need for the movie Milk, how we had to have a movie like that. And one of the commenters took me for task because I couldn't quickly come up with a good example of somebody who could be a conservative icon that we lionize. And so I wrote that today. So if you go to Town Hall or AOL, or I'm sorry, politicsdaily.com, you can read my take on that. So you helped inspire the John Huntsman thing. His name is being mentioned.
So who's the conservative milk? I want to know.
I had 3 ideas. One idea is Whittaker Chambers, which would be the book Witness, which is fascinating. The story of him, being a communist, and it's still very cloak and dagger. You got the pumpkin papers. Richard Nixon's involved. That would be a great.
You want to go straight for the Joe McCarthy?
Well, we're trying to find conservatives we can lionize. Let's see. Another one was just the Duke Lacrosse story, which is a great example of just the egregious misuse of prosecutorial powers, and that could be a good story. And the third one is actually William F. Buckley, a fascinating guy, not only for his God and Man at Yale and starting a magazine, but he was a sailor. I think he was in the FBI or the CIA at one point. Just an amazing story. He would go on TV with like Gore Vidal and threaten to punch him in the mouth. I mean, fascinating guy, and I think we could definitely. There's young conservatives out there who could look up to somebody like Bill Buckley.
Any of those movies would be better than American Carol.
I think you're right. But here's a point I also did make, which is interesting. Although Hollywood tends to make movies that lionize liberal, like modern-day liberal politicians, there are a lot of conservative themes in Hollywood movies. And there are also movies like The Chronicles of Narnia or The Passion of the Christ, which conservatives do rally around, which are also probably
The Incredibles.
The Incredibles is a good movie, and all of them are probably better than American Carol. So, a movie which I, in all honesty, did not see. So I can't,
You and all of America.
But I encourage them to keep trying because we need to make good movies. So.
But back to John Ensign.
Yes. Again, to me, it wasn't so much about John Ensign as just the interesting story that we're already speculating about 2012. And by the way, race for 2012 will be one of the places to keep an eye on. But people were obviously following Huckabee. There's been a lot of blog chatter about Mitt Romney lately. You got Sarah Palin and her many interesting things happening to her. But now we're hearing these outsiders. We're hearing about John Ensign. We're hearing about John Huntsman. Keep in mind, it's entirely possible that the person who wins the nomination is somebody we don't even think about right now. I mean, Mike Huckabee, I bet you 3 or 4 years, I guess back in 2005, people would have laughed at you if you would have said Mike Huckabee's going to win the nomination. Of course, he didn't win the nomination, but he may well have. And so it's entirely possible that one of these, really dark horses at least gives us a good show.
No one was thinking of Bill Clinton in 1989, I'm sure.
Yeah, another classic.
He was laughed off the stage after the Democratic Convention in '88.
Well, they applauded when he stopped, actually.
Right. But I'm interested that I remember in those 1990 after the Gulf War, all the Democratic A-list, begged off. They figured this is not our year. Bush is in the 90s, approval-wise, forget it.
Yep,
and
exactly right.
It was the second tier that stuck around, and Bill Clinton, ended up winning.
Yeah, it was either Clinton or Sanders.
Interesting that it doesn't seem like the Republican field is scared off from running. People want this early.
Well, it seems like they do. But I've said this before. If I were advising, say, Jindal or Palin, I would advise them to wait, to keep their powder dry, to get experience, to be a governor for 2 terms. In the case of Palin, she's got some stuff to learn. Maybe Jindal can work on his communication skills. I do think Mitt Romney will run. And I think that he's sort of the other side of the equation, that Romney, essentially, this is his last rodeo, I would think. But in the case of Palin and Jindal, the sort of younger up-and-comers, I would tell them to wait till you have an open shot at the presidency.
Has the conservative blogosphere had a reaction to the myriad of tabloid Palin family stories that have come out lately? Has it shaken some of the loyalty that's been had towards Palin so far?
I think so. I think that what you're seeing, and I'm probably an example of this, Carol Platt-Lebeau, I think that's how I say her last name. She blogs at townhall.com with me. I think what you've seen is there are still conservatives defending her, and I will continue to defend her against these egregious attacks. But I think you're also nobody has come out really and written the "I'm no longer on the Palin bandwagon." Like, that hasn't happened. There hasn't been like a definitive "this is the last straw." But I think that you just sort of subtly, through observing, there's a bit of a Palin fatigue. And I think that, conservative bloggers are starting to get tired of the continuous antics and having to constantly sort of be on defense about her.
And that's giving Ensign the fresh opening. Maybe.
Let me say this about Ensign. Here's a personal story that I've written about that I don't think anyone else has. But I heard a source told me a few years ago that Ensign had a deal with Harry Reid where they would not attack each other. Now, Ensign was head of the NRSC at the time, the senatorial committee, and they would not comment. I contacted them multiple times, and they would not comment about this, which leads me to believe that it was true. Which is not, it's not really cool. I don't think. How would you like it if because the head of the DNC was from Ohio, he's not willing to take a shot at Boehner or something like that? It's just ridiculous.
Well, it's a very old school way of policy being practiced. I think it used to be. I may be jumbling memories from my childhood, but I believe there were times when, if Reagan was going to cut a deal with Democrats on the Hill, that part of the deal was, hey, you vote with me, I'm not going to go campaign against you in your district.
Yeah. And that's the kind of stuff that I think
that sort of bipartisan attitude definitely has diminished.
Yeah, they're both from Nevada, and it's entirely possible that Harry Reid said, "Don't ever take sides with anybody outside the family," and so it could be that that's a lame Godfather joke, which I'm a huge fan of, by the way. No, but I mean, it is old school politics, and I think that. My guess is, if it happened on the Democratic side, that Marcos Militis would be very critical of it.
Oh, I'm sure, and they have been critical. They're very critical of Debbie Wasserman Schultz when she was hesitating from attacking some Florida Republicans. Yeah. So there's definite frustration at those sorts of deals.
Yep, and I see both sides of it actually, but more so, I always wondered about the Daschle race. Like if Bush hadn't come out so hard against Daschle in support of John Thune, I always wonder if that was sort of one of the defining moments where, because remember, Daschle had been very supportive of Bush after 9/11. I always wonder. I mean, let me ask you. I mean, as someone on the other side of the aisle, did that strike you as sort of okay? Well, this is how the game's going to be played.
Well, I think from a liberal blogosphere stance, our cry always was to the Washington Democrats: "This is how the game is played, you morons."
So you're saying that? Gotcha. So it didn't surprise you. You thought they were naive to
right. It was another opportunity to say, stop playing footsie with these folks and thinking that it's 1963 in Washington all over again, because it's just not.
Right. How is it that we're more like politically astute than these guys who are somehow get elected to Senate? Unbelievable. It's like I can always make the calls better than Zorn, during football season, or even Joe Gibbs. I mean, how could he call 2 consecutive timeouts to freeze the kicker? That was ridiculous.
Perhaps we should leave it on that note.
Yes.
Always good to talk to you.
Yes, Bill, good talking to you, man, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Excellent.
All right, thanks.
Take care.